When my brother and I arrived at our grandfather's cabin, we didn't expect to find much other than dust and memories. The place had been closed for years, since he passed away, and seemed frozen in time. The smell of aged wood and mold filled the air, and the weak light that came in through the dirty windows gave the environment an almost claustrophobic feeling. We spent the afternoon organizing some things, reviewing old photos, and trying to ignore the strange feeling that place caused us. It was while we were figging in the living room closet that we found an old, rusty key with an erased label. We remember that our grandfather always mentioned a basement, but never let us in. Curious, we looked for the entrance until we found a ladder hidden under a thick carpet. The door in the end creaked as if it hadn't been opened for decades, but it gave way after a few attempts. Inside, we found boxes of old things, rusty tools, and, thrown in a corner, a Ouija board. My brother took the board and laughed, suggesting that we try to talk to our grandfather. I thought the idea was stupid, but deep down I was also curious. We lighted some candles and sat on the floor of the cabin, ready for what we thought was just a harmless joke. We put our fingers on the pointer and started with silly questions, as if our grandfather was there and if he wanted to tell us something. For long minutes, nothing happened, and I was ready to drop it when the pointer began to move. At first, I thought my brother was pushing, but he swore he wouldn't. The answer was simple, no. We felt a chill, but we continued with the joke, asking who was there. The pointer slid slowly, forming the word hate. At that moment, we laughed nervously, convinced that someone was playing a trick. But then, the candles trembled, and the pointer moved by itself, fast, forming a sequence of words that froze our blood. Go out now. My brother dropped the board and got up, saying it was bullshit to continue. But before we could put things away, we heard a noise upstairs, as if something had fallen. We looked at each other, hoping to hear something else, but the silence that followed was even worse. When we went up to check, we found some chairs away from the table, and a picture frame of our grandfather, lying on the floor, the shattered glass. Something wasn't right. We started to collect our things to leave, but then we heard, coming from the forest around the hut, low voices. They called our names. My first instinct was to believe that someone was playing a trick on us, maybe neighbors in the region or some lost hunter. But then I realized that the voices came from different directions, as if they were surrounding us. The way they called our names was wrong. It didn't look like someone trying to scare us, but something who knew exactly who we were. My brother took his cell phone to illuminate the darkness outside, but the flashlight blinked and went out of nowhere. At the same time, all the lights in the cabin flashed, and the generator snored loudly before dying completely, leaving us in the most absolute pitch. The silence that followed was suffocating. We stood still for a few seconds, listening only to our own accelerated breaths. Suddenly, a dry noise echoed from the locked basement. Something had moped down there. I swallowed hard and tried to ignore the panic rising down my throat. My brother ran to the door to try to open it, but it wouldn't give in. The voices outside continued, now closer, and the noise in the basement returned, this time as if something was scraping against the wood, trying to get out. At this point, we could no longer pretend it was our imagination. Something or someone was calling us outside, while something else was moving inside the cabin. My brother insisted that we should leave, run to the car and leave, but the key was in the room, and none of us had the courage to go up the stairs in the dark. We tried to turn on the cell phone to use the flashlight, but the screen only showed static, as if it had completely lost the signal. The worst came soon after. 3 dry knocks sounded at the door of the cabin, not strong but firm, as if whoever was there knew we were listening. My stomach turned. None of us moved. The wood creaky. The door latch made a slight click, as if it were being tested. My brother held my arm tightly, his eyes wide. Then a voice whispered on the other side of the door, so low that it almost didn't seem real. Open. The sound of the voice cut me like a blade. It was almost impossible to believe, but something inside me knew that we were not alone. The door was locked, and I was sure that no one could have approached without us noticing. But there it was, a clear and cold voice, as if it came directly from outside, and not from someone real. I looked at my brother, who was paralyzed, without reaction. I don't know how, but without thinking, I got up slowly and went to the door. Every step I took seemed to make the environment heavier, as if the air around me was denser. The cold in the spine only increased. When I put my hand on the doorknob, my breathing became heavier. I knew that the simple act of opening that door could change everything. Or maybe it was already changed, and we didn't see it. At that moment, a horrible feeling of being watched took over me. as if I were being watched by something that shouldn't be there. That's when, out of nowhere, the door opened by itself. I didn't move her. She just opened up, as if someone outside was waiting for our permission. And what I found was not a person or something tangible. It was a darkness so thick that it seemed to swallow the light. I stayed there, paralyzed, panic consuming me. Something at the bottom of that darkness was waiting for us. The air around the door seemed to be colder than usual, and the darkness beyond it seemed to swallow me. The silence was so dense that any movement seemed like a violation. I took a deep breath, trying to force my muscles to move, but my legs were stuck. The feeling of being watched came back with full force, and I couldn't think clearly anymore. That's when I heard a noise, low and muffled, coming from inside the cabin, like a soft whisper, almost imperceptible, but enough to make me tremble. My brother, who until then had been standing still, finally moved. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of fear and despair. He babbled something, but I could barely hear his words, such was the tension in the environment. The feeling that we were being watched became even stronger, as if the eyes of something invisible were fixed on us. But we couldn't see anything. The tension in the cabin was accumulating, and the only thing I wanted was to get out of there, but an inexplicable force kept me trapped. I felt a growing pressure on my chest, as if something was holding my breath. The clock on the wall stopped, and the darkness seemed to have deepened even more. When my hand moved away from the doorknob, the door closed with a slam, as if it had its own will. I knew something was wrong. I knew we had touched something that shouldn't be touched, and now, whatever it was there with us. But the worst was yet to come. I tried to stay calm, but it was impossible. The noise of the voices in the forest didn't stop, and the idea that someone or something was calling by our names made me more paralyzed every second. I looked at my brother, and he seemed as lost as I was. His eyes were glazed, as if he was hearing something I couldn't. Every time he turned to look at the window, the expression of terror on his face only increased. I wanted to talk, but the feeling that something was about to happen prevented me from any movement. After a few minutes that seemed like hours, my brother finally approached the locked basement door. I wanted to scream for him not to open, but I also knew that, somehow, there was no choice. The tension was unbearable, and whatever was inside had been watching us for a long time. He looked at me with an expression of despair, but with a certain determination, as if he felt that we would only get out of there alive if we faced that once and for all. When he finally took the rusty key and turned it in the lock, the sound of the metal fitting into the door reverberated throughout the cabin, and the feeling of cold intensified, as if a wave of icy air had invaded the place. The door creaked when it was opened, and the darkness of the basement seemed to expand to the rest of the house. I felt totally helpless, trapped inside that unbearable atmosphere, and it was there, at that very moment, that dread took over me, as if everything that had happened until then was just a preparation for the worst. The moment the basement door finally opened was like a point of no return. The darkness inside was dense, as if swallowing all the light around. My brother, who was already paralyzed, hesitated for a second before taking a step inside. I wanted to scream, stop it, but something was holding me back. The feeling that we would be dead if we didn't face that was too strong. Then, with my heart racing, I went behind him, without the courage to look back. Down there, the smell was of mold and wet earth. It was such a stuffy place that it seemed that the air refused to come out. My eyes began to adjust to the darkness, and that's when I saw an old object, covered by a dust cover, was in the center of the basement. It was a rocking chair, but it wasn't just any chair. She seemed to have been there for decades, with the wood scratched and the ropes broken. I approached slowly, and soon I felt something strange. The feeling of being observed intensified, but there was nothing else there, just the chair motionless. When my brother approached, the chair swayed. There was no wind. I couldn't even scream. The voices that still came from the forest now seemed closer, almost like whispers, and the only thing I could do was look at my brother and, with an abrupt movement, try to get out of there. When we were going up the stairs, the sound of the swaying chair was replaced by something much more disturbing, a loud thud coming from the basement door, as if something had thrown itself against it. We ran back to the cabin room, and I had never heard my brother so desperate, but when we looked around, we realized that everything was different. The furniture was out of place, as if someone had moved everything, and the strangest thing of all was that the cabin door was slightly open, as if someone had entered while we were not there. Panic took over, and the only thing I could think of was getting out of there as soon as possible. But when I looked back, I saw the reflection in the cabin window. Something was there, standing in the darkness of the forest, watching us. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. What was that something in the forest? And who or what was inside the cabin? I still wonder if we really managed to get out of there alive, or if it followed us forever. Were all the signs there, and we just couldn't see before? If you've been through something similar, share it, because to this day I can't understand what happened. What would you do in my place? I never thought something so strange could happen on a simple trail, but here I am, telling what happened that day. My wife and I decided to explore a hut we found while walking along a remote trail in the mountains. The hut seemed abandoned, with the walls worn and covered by moss, but what caught my attention the most was the silence that surrounded it, as if the place was frozen in time. When we entered, we realized that there were old furniture, clothes scattered around some rooms, and personal objects that seemed still in use. But there was no one there. Everything was dirty and dusty, but in some corners, we noticed that some things were cleaner than usual, as if someone was trying to keep the place in order. It didn't make sense. When we decided to leave, something even more bizarre happened. A strong smell of cigarettes took the air, and I'm not talking about a smell of fresh cigarette, but that sickening smell of old cigarette, as if someone had smoked there recently. My wife and I looked at each other, confused, because none of us smoke. The cabin was completely closed when we arrived. There were no signs that someone had passed by, but the smell was so intense that it looked like someone was smoking in front of us. The feeling of discomfort was growing, and we couldn't understand how something like this could have happened in a completely isolated and locked place. We tried to ignore that smell and began to take the last glances around before leaving, but the feeling of discomfort only increased. When we passed by one of the rooms, I noticed something strange. A chair was positioned near the window, as if someone had stood there, looking outside. It made me feel a chill down my spine. The feeling that we were not alone in the cabin became even stronger. I told my wife that it was time for us to leave, but before leaving, she noticed something even weirder. A leather wallet thrown on the table, open, as if it had been left there in a hurry. Inside, there were some yellowed photos and a receipt of something bought less than a week ago. How was this possible? The cabin was visibly abandoned, with time dragging on in its decadence. It didn't make any sense. The tension increased when trying to go out the door, a door in the back of the house closed by itself. My wife and I were paralyzed for a moment, looking at each other. There was no wind, there was nothing that could justify that movement. She tried to reassure me, saying that it was just our mind playing tricks, but something in me couldn't help but feel that there was something there, something that didn't want us to leave. We decided to leave immediately, but when we passed through the living room again, the smell of cigarettes got even stronger. It was as if he was chasing us. Panic took over, and that's when we realized that we no longer had control over that situation. Something or someone was watching us, and that was not a coincidence. It was as if the air inside the cabin was getting denser, and a feeling of claustrophobia took over me. We decided to take one last look at the kitchen, and that's where the most bizarre thing happened. A cup was on the counter, as if it had just been used, but the place had been empty for a long time. I looked at my wife, and saw the fear in her eyes, reflecting exactly what I was feeling. We didn't know what to do, but our legs already looked heavy, as if we were being dragged back to that place. The idea of leaving seemed impossible. Something was holding us there, and no matter how much we tried to leave, the feeling of being watched increased. Every step we took in the direction of the door seemed to be more difficult than the previous one. So, when we finally got to the main door, it was locked. I was sure we had left it open before, but now it didn't matter. I looked around, as if I expected to see someone behind me, but everything was quiet, still too much. The smell of cigarettes was unbearable. I went to the window, trying to force my vision out, hoping to see some sign of life. Nothing. Only the same desolate and endless landscape. I was almost panicking when, out of nowhere, a very strong knock on the wall behind me made my heart stop. I went back immediately, but there was no one. The beating echoed in the empty house, and for a moment, I was paralyzed. When I looked at my wife, she was as scared as I was. That's when she said something that made me freeze. I saw a shadow moving in the window. I immediately turned to the window, but I saw nothing but the dusty glass reflecting my own pale face. My heart was racing, and I could already feel the cold sweat running down the back of my neck. My wife grabbed my arm tightly, and I could see that she was shaking. "We need to get out of here now," she whispered, her voice almost failing. I agreed, but the door was still locked. I took my pocket knife, and tried to force the handle, without success. The smell of cigarettes seemed to be getting stronger and stronger, as if someone was smoking on our side. Suddenly, we heard a noise coming from the corridor steps. Slow, dragged steps, as if someone were approaching, but without haste. The panic hit for good. I ran to one of the windows and tried to force it, but the wood seemed swollen by time, stopping everything. My wife started crying, and that made me realize that we couldn't get desperate. I took an old chair and hit the glass with all my strength, shattering it. The moment the glass broke, the steps stoppered, and absolute silence took over the hut, so dense that you could almost feel the pressure in the chest. I looked back, hoping to see something, anything, but the corridor was empty. Without wasting any more time, I helped my wife get out the window and jumped right after, feeling the shards tear my skin. We barely had time to pull ourselves together when we heard a sound that I will never forget, a low and rough laugh coming from inside the cabin. We ran without looking back, our feet sinking in the fluffy earth of the trail. The icy air of the forest seemed even heavier, as if something was accompanying us, watching us. My chest burned from shortness of breath, but I didn't stop running. I only stopped when we reached the point where we had left the car. I instinctively turned to the trail, expecting to see someone coming out of the cabin, some shadow moving between the trees. But there was nothing, only the overwhelming silence of the forest. We got into the car in a hurry, and started from there. My wife didn't say a word all the way back, and neither did I. We both knew something was wrong with that place. And whatever it was, I didn't want us to leave. We got home late at night, exhausted and shaken. For a while, I tried to convince myself that it had been nothing but a great coincidence. Maybe the smell of cigarettes was just an old smell impregnated in the wood. Maybe the steps were some animal walking on the roof. But then, a few nights later, while we were lying down trying to sleep, I felt a strong smell of cigarettes in the room. It was the same smell of that cabin. Since then, once in a while, I feel the same smell of nothing. I never see anyone, I never hear anything but my own heart beating faster. But every time I smell that smell, I get the same feeling of the trail that day, that someone is watching me, smiling in the dark. Have you ever been to a place where you felt, deep down, that you shouldn't be? I've never been the type to be easily impressed. I always thought that most scary stories were the result of exaggeration or fertile imagination. But what happened in that cabin, I can't explain. It's been a short time, and I still find myself reliving everything in my head, trying to find a rational explanation. Me and two friends, Diego and Marcos, rented a remote cabin for a weekend of fishing and rest. The place was very isolated, with no neighbors nearby, and the only dirt road that led there seemed little used. At first, it seemed perfect. We spent the day drinking, talking, and exploring the surroundings. Everything was normal until nightfall. After dinner, we went out to the balcony to relax. Diego lit a cigarette and leaned against the grill, looking at the trail that led to the lake. Suddenly, he froze. "There's someone there," he said in a strange tone. Marcos and I went to him, trying to see in the dark. In the middle of the trail, illuminated only by the moonlight, there was a standing man. He didn't react. He was just there, staring at us. We tried to call, ask if he needed anything, but he didn't answer. And then, in the blink of an eye, he was no longer there. We stood there for a while, trying to understand what had just happened. None of us saw the guy turn around and leave. He just disappeared. Diego swore that he didn't blink, that he didn't look away even for a second. Marcos tried to laugh and say that it could have been a trunk or a strange shadow, but you could see that he himself did not believe it. The weather changed completely after that. We went back into the cabin and locked the door, but the feeling that we were not alone remained in the air. We slept badly that night. Each crack in the old wood of the hut seemed like a step. Each gust of wind seemed like a whisper. In the morning, we tried to forget and act as if nothing had happened. But as soon as we went out to breathe some fresh air, we saw the footprints. They were all over the wet earth around the hut. Deep footprints, as if someone had walked in circles there all night. The problem? There were no traces of going or back, as if whoever it was had simply appeared there, and disappeared out of nowhere. We stood there, looking at those footprints as if they were some illusion. Diego was the first to break the silence. He lowered, touched the earth, and said the obvious. "This here is fresh, man. That was at dawn." None of us wanted to admit it out loud, but it was clear that someone, or something, was very close to us while we slept. Marcos tried to give a logical explanation, saying that it could be an animal or even our footprints from the previous day, but it was impossible to ignore that they were clear and only around the hut. We decided to go for a walk to see if we found more traces, or any sign of someone. We walked a good few meters down the trail, but there were no more footprints, no broken branches, no sign that someone had passed by. It was as if that had started and ended exactly where we were. The worst thing is that, while we were walking, we couldn't ignore the feeling that we were being watched. Diego commented that he felt a weight on his back, as if there was someone right behind him. I felt the same. Marcos, who always tried to play the skeptic, this time was quiet. We went back to the cabin trying to act as if it was nothing, but the weather had changed. No one talked much, and even breakfast was silent. Marcos, who always had a joke for everything, just kept touching the coffee mug without saying anything. Diego tried to disguise, but you could see that he was restless, looking at the windows from time to time. I felt vulnerable inside, as if that cabin was an aquarium and someone outside was watching us without us being able to see. In the early afternoon, we decided to go to the lake to fish and get it out of our heads. We walked the trail in silence, the three of us on alert, as if we were waiting for something to come up at any moment. When we got to the water's edge, I noticed something strange. On the shore, near where we left our things the day before, there were marks on the earth, as if someone had stood there watching. The problem was that those brands were not ours. They looked like footprints, but deeper, as if the person who left them was heavier or had been standing there for a long time. The discomfort increased. Diego tried to rationalize, saying that maybe it was our footprints and the dawn rain had distorted them, but it didn't make sense. The marks were deep, as if someone had pressed their feet against the wet earth for a long time. In addition, they were fresh. Whoever was there hadn't left for a long time. I looked around, feeling a cold go up my spine. The forest seemed denser, more closed. None of us wanted to stay there for a long time, so we pretended nothing was happening and tried to fish. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. After a few hours, we decided to come back. On the way back, the silence was suffocating. What used to look like a quiet walk was now a tense walk, and every branch squeaking or bird sound made us accelerate our steps. When we arrived at the cabin, Diego was the first to notice. The door, which we had left locked, was ajar. We stood at the entrance, exchanging glances. None of us had the courage to say the obvious. Someone was there while we were away. The air inside the cabin seemed colder, heavier. Everything seemed to be in place, but there was something wrong, something we couldn't identify right away. Until Joao pointed to the kitchen table. There was a glass of water there. Full. No one had left that glass there before. My heart raced. If someone came in, why didn't they take anything? Why didn't you destroy anything? Why did you just leave a glass of water? We didn't stay to find out. We took our things in a hurry and left there without looking back. On the dirt road, no one said anything, but we all knew something was wrong. When we arrived in the city and stopped to refuel, a man saw us getting out of the car and casually asked, "You were in the old cabin, right? Did you see him?" We didn't ask who he was. We just travel, without ever coming back. And you? Have you ever had the feeling of being watched when you knew you should be completely alone?